The Night of Shivering Wings. In a quiet village nestled between dark pine forests and rolling hills veiled in silver mist, there lived a young girl named Alira. The village itself was small and easily forgotten by the wider world, a scattering of stone cottages with moss-covered roofs, narrow paths etched by years of footsteps, and fields that yielded just enough grain to carry its people through the year. In winter, smoke curled lazily from chimneys like fatting ribbons, and the air smelled of pine sap and wood ash. Alira's cottage stood at the very edge of the village, closest to the forest. It was the last home before the trees thickened and swallowed the path into shadow. Some villagers thought it an unlucky place to live. The forest was old, and old forests were said to remember things better left forgotten, yet Alira had never feared it. She was not known for wealth, for she had little of it. Nor was she known for beauty that turned heads or cleverness that drew praise from scholars. Instead, she was known for her gentle heart. She greeted each morning as if it were a gift and treated every living thing as though it were worthy of kindness. When winter arrived, most villagers shut their doors tightly against the biting wind. They stuffed cloth beneath cracks, reinforced shutters, and spoke of enduring the cold rather than embracing it. Alira, however, always left a small offering on her windowsill, crumbs of bread for sparrows, seeds for finches, and sometimes scraps of vegetable for wandering creatures that dared approach. She believed that hunger felt the same in every stomach. The winter that year was harsher than any in memory. Snow fell early and did not melt. It layered the fields in thick blankets, bending the dry stalks beneath its weight. The river froze along its edges, and fishermen struck its surface with axes to carve holes for their lines. The forest grew silent. Even the wind seemed sharper, as though it carried knives in its breath. On the evening it happened, the sky was the color of bruised steel. Clouds gathered heavily, pressing down upon the village as though they meant to crush it. Alira had spent the day mending woolen gloves for the miller's wife, and though her fingers ached, she hummed softly as she worked. A single candle flickered beside her, its light trembling whenever a draft slipped through the wooden walls. By nightfall, the storm began in earnest. Snow did not fall gently, it hurled itself from the heavens in furious spirals. The wind shrieked through the trees, bending them until their branches clawed at the sky. It rattled shutters and hammered doors, testing the strength of every home. Alira placed another log into the hearth and wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fire snapped and crackled, sending sparks upward like fleeting stars. She sat on her small stool and stared into the flames, listening to the storm's rage. There was a loneliness in such nights, a vast, echoing quiet beneath the noise. She wondered briefly how the sparrows fared, whether they had found hollow trunks to shield them. She thought of the stray gray cat that sometimes lingered near her door and hoped it had discovered warmth somewhere safe. Then she heard it. A faint sound beneath the wind. Scratch. Alira lifted her head. The wind howled again, drowning everything else. She waited, her heart beating softly in her ears. Scratch, scratch. It came from the door. At first she assumed it was a loose branch scraping against the wood. The forest was close, and in violent storms branches often snapped and flew, yet something in the rhythm unsettled her. It was uneven, hesitant, almost pleading. She rose slowly, her bare feet silent against the worn floorboards. The firelight cast long shadows along the walls, stretching and shrinking as the flames danced. The scratching came again, weak, faltering. "Who's there?" she called softly, though she knew no one would venture out on such a night. There was no answer, only the wind's relentless cry. Her hand hovered over the latch. For a fleeting moment, fear brushed her thoughts. The villagers often told tales during winter evenings, stories of wandering spirits that sought shelter only to steal warmth from the living, of creatures from the deep woods that lured kind souls into darkness. But Alira had always believed that fear grew strongest where compassion was weakest. She lifted the latch and pulled the door open. The wind burst inward in a whirl of snow and icy breath, nearly extinguishing the candle behind her. She gasped at the sudden cold and at the sight before her. Two small shapes collapsed over the threshold, tumbling onto her floor in a flurry of white. At first she thought them fox cubs. Their bodies were no larger than young foxes, slender and trembling. But as the snow slid from their forms, the firelight revealed something else entirely. Scales. Not fur, but scales dulled by frost and rimed with ice. Tiny wings, thin and delicate as parchment, folded awkwardly against narrow backs. Their tails curled weakly, tipped with little ridges that glinted faintly in the fire's glow. Thin wisps of smoke escaped their nostrils, dissipating almost instantly in the cold air. Dragon hatchlings. Alira's breath caught in her throat. Every child in the village had grown up on tales of dragons, mighty creatures that ruled the skies, that hoarded gold and scorched armies with fire. They were said to be merciless and proud, creatures who regarded humans as little more than ants. Yet these two did not resemble the monsters of legend. They were shaking violently, their bodies pressed close together. One let out a tiny, broken chirp, more like the cry of a frightened bird than the roar of a beast. Their golden eyes, half-lidded and clouded with cold, blinked up at her. They were not fearsome. They were phrasing. Alira did not think of danger. She did not think of what might follow if their mother came searching in fury. She saw only small lives flickering at the edge of extinction. Without hesitation, she knelt and gathered them into her arms. They were lighter than she expected, their bodies cold as river stones in winter. The scales beneath her fingers felt fragile, almost brittle. One of them attempted a feeble protest, releasing a faint puff of smoke that curled harmlessly into the air before fatting. "It's all right," she whispered, though she doubted they understood words. "You're safe." She kicked the door shut behind her, sealing out the storm, and hurried toward the hearth. The fire flared as she fed it another log, coaxing it to life. Sparks leapt upward, casting brighter light across the room. She set the hatchlings upon a folded woolen blanket near the warmth. They instinctively edged closer to the heat, their small claws scraping softly against the floor. Steam rose faintly from their scales as the frost began to melt. Alira fetched another blanket, her thickest one, and wrapped it gently around their trembling forms. She moved carefully, afraid of hurting them. Though they possessed claws and teeth, they did not attempt to use them. Instead, they huddled together, pressing into the wool and inching nearer to the flames. Their breathing was shallow. Alira's heart tightened. She poured goat's milk into a small pot and warmed it over the fire, stirring slowly so it would not scorch. She tore pieces of bread and soaked them in broth left from her evening meal, softening them until they nearly dissolved. When the milk was warm, not hot, she poured it into a shallow wooden bowl and brought it to the hatchlings. At first, they only stared, wary and confused. Then one extended a small, forked tongue and tasted the liquid. Its eyes brightened. It lapped eagerly, nudging its sibling aside in its haste. The second soon followed, their tiny tongues flicking quickly as they drank. The sound was faint but unmistakably alive. Relief washed over Alira so strongly she nearly wept. Slowly, she murmured, "There is enough." She fed them small bits of soaked bread, holding the pieces near their mouths. They accepted the food with surprising gentleness, their sharp teeth grazing her fingers but never biting. Gradually, the violent shivering subsided. Their bodies remained cold, but warmth began to return. The dullness of their scales softened, revealing faint hints of color beneath the frost. One shimmered with pale silver blue, the other with muted crimson. Outside, the storm intensified. Snow battered the cottage walls, and wind roared across the roof like an angry tide. The world beyond her door had vanished into white chaos. Inside, the air filled with the scent of smoke and warm milk. The hatchlings finished their meal and curled tightly together within the folds of the blanket. One rested its small head against the other's neck. Their breathing deepened, steadier now. Alira sat beside them, watching carefully. Every few moments she reached out to ensure they were still warm. She could feel faint heat radiating from their bodies, weak embers struggling to grow. As the hours passed, the fire crackled and popped. Shadows swayed along the walls like silent dancers. The storm did not relent. Alira's thoughts wandered. What had driven them from their nest? Dragons were said to dwell in high mountain caverns or deep within hidden valleys. Had they strayed too far? Had the storm torn them from their home? Or had something worse forced them into the cold? She glanced toward the ceiling, imagining vast wings beating against the clouds. If their mother searched for them, what would she think upon finding them in a human's cottage? The idea might have frightened someone else. But Alira only hoped that wherever the great dragon was, she would know her children were safe. One of the hatchlings stirred in its sleep, releasing a tiny chirrup. A faint glow pulsed beneath its scales, an instinctive flicker of inner fire. The warmth spread gently through the blanket. Alira smiled. "You are stronger than you know," she whispered. Hours drifted by like falling snowflakes, silent and countless. At last, exhaustion weighed upon her. She could not leave them alone by the hearth. The fire might burn too low or they might grow chilled again. So she lay down beside them on the floor, pulling part of the blanket over herself. The stone beneath was hard, but she did not mind. She extended one arm protectively around the small bundle of scales and wings. The hatchlings shifted instinctively toward her warmth. Outside, the storm raged as though determined to tear the world apart. The wind screamed through the trees and branches snapped in the darkness. Yet within the small cottage at the forest's edge, something fragile and beautiful endured. Alira's breathing slowed as sleep claimed her. The fire burned low but steady, casting a golden halo around the unlikely trio. The hatchlings' bodies glowed faintly now, their inner flames rekindling with each passing minute. Their tails twitched in dreams of soaring skis they had barely known. Far above the storm clouds, unseen by mortal eyes, something ancient stirred. A presence vast and watchful shifted in the darkness of the heavens. It sensed the flicker of two small lives once fading, now warming. It felt the echo of human kindness wrapping around dragon hearts like a shield against winter's cruelty. The storm began to change. Though the wind still howled, its fury lost its edge. Snow continued to fall, but more gently now, as if guided by unseen restraint. The forest, which had groaned beneath the gale's assault, seemed to breathe again. Within the cottage, Alira slept peacefully, unaware of the forces moving beyond her humble walls. The hatchlings nestled closer against her side, their scales no longer rimed with frost but gleaming faintly in hues of silver blue and crimson. Tiny wisps of smoke rose and vanished in the warm air above the hearth. The night stretched on, deep and endless. Yet in that small home at the edge of the world, warmth had taken root where death had nearly claimed victory. And as the darkest hours slowly yielded to the promise of dawn, the storm's roar softened into a distant whisper, like a great beast bowing its head in silent acknowledgement of a young girl's gentle heart. The Emperor in the clouds. Far beyond the jagged spine of the northern mountains, where mortal paths ended and only the wind dared wander, there stretched a realm untouched by human feet. Peaks of black stone pierced the heavens like the crowns of ancient kings, their summits lost in endless wreaths of cloud. Lightning often threaded between them in silent arcs, and the air itself shimmered with a quiet, untamed power. Above even those peaks, above the storm-racked skies and the drifting kingdoms of cloud, there existed a vast dominion of light and flame. There ruled the Dragon Emperors. He was older than the oldest mountain and had watched rivers carve their first winding paths through the earth. His scales shimmered like molten gold fresh from the forge, each one edged in crimson firelight. When he unfurled his wings, they spanned farther than the length of a valley, vast membranes veined with living flame. His eyes burned with the brilliance of twin suns, and within their depths lay memory, centuries upon centuries of triumph, sorrow, war, and quiet guardianship. He did not dwell in a castle of stone, nor sit upon a throne shaped by mortal hands. His throne was the sky itself. His court was the circling winds and drifting constellations. From his celestial heights he watched over all dragonkind, every hatchling hidden in mountain caverns, every ancient worm slumbering beneath desert sands, every proud skyrider who claimed dominion over distant horizons. To dragons, he was not merely ruler. He was origin, he was flame, he was legacy. On that winter night, while snow ravaged the valleys below and the forest bent beneath icy fury, the Emperor rested upon a plateau of cloud and light. Around him, lesser dragons spiraled in distant arcs, their forms small compared to his immensity. The moon hung pale behind veils of storm, casting silver glints upon his gleaming scales. Then he felt it. A flicker. To mortals it would have gone unnoticed, a subtle shift in the fabric of the world. But to him, whose senses stretched across leagues of land and sky, it struck like a discordant note in a sacred song. Two flames, young and fragile, faltered. His eyes snapped open, blazing brighter than the storm lightning. He knew those flames. They were bound to his own essence, threads woven from his ancient fire. Royal hatchlings, newly born in the hidden valley far beyond mortal knowledge. They were his blood, his legacy, the continuation of a lineage that had endured since the dawn of flame. They had been sheltered deep within a sanctuary of stone and warmth, guarded by vigilant kin. No storm should have reached them, no frost should have dared touch their scales. Yet he felt the cold closing in around them. The Emperor rose in a single sweeping motion, wings unfurling with a thunderous rush. The clouds parted beneath the force of his ascent, spiraling outward in luminous shockwaves. Lightning fractured around him, drawn to his power like sparks to a forge. He inhaled deeply, drawing in the scent of the world, the resin of pine forests, the sharp bite of frozen rivers, the iron tang of distant cliffs. But the storm was merciless. It churned the air into chaos, scattering scent and sound alike. His hatchlings had wandered. Curiosity burned fiercely in dragon young, sometimes more fiercely than wisdom. Perhaps they had slipped from the warmth of their nesting cavern in pursuit of snowflakes glimmering like falling stars. Perhaps a playful gust had carried them farther than intended, or perhaps fate itself had nudged their fragile wings toward trial. The Emperor doves. His descent tore through the upper storm clouds, and thunder rolled in his wake. Snow swirled violently, flung aside by the force of his passage, yet even he, with all his vastness, could not immediately pierce the heart of the blizzard. The storm was unnatural in its intensity, fed by mountain winds and sharpened by winter's cruel hand. It swallowed sight and scent alike, wrapping the world in a white abyss. He roared then not in anger but in command. The sound reverberated across the peaks, shaking loose avalanches that thundered down distant slopes. Lesser dragons answered from afar, their calls echoing in alarm, but none dared approach too closely, for the Emperor's focus was absolute. Still, he could not find them. The storm obscured their fragile flames, dimming them to near nothing. He felt them flicker, faint, unsteady, threatened by frost that crept ever closer. For the first time in centuries, something akin to fear stirred within his ancient heart. He circled lower, immense wings beating against the chaos. His golden scales cut through snow like sunlight through mist, yet the valley below remained indistinct. Villages lay buried under white drifts, forests blurred into shadowed masses, rivers vanished beneath sheets of ice. He extended his awareness beyond mere sight, reaching through the subtle currents of magic that bound dragonkind. He sought the unique resonance of his bloodline, the cadence of fire that sang in harmony with his own. There, faint distant, not in the mountains, not in any cavern of stone. The flames were moving no longer. They hovered at the very edge of extinction, yet they did not vanish. Something shielded them. Confusion rippled through him. No dragon guardian lingered nearby. No ancient worm had intercepted the hatchlings. The warmth surrounding them was not draconic in origin. It was a smaller, softer, humans. The Emperor slowed, hovering above the thinning clouds. Dawn approached, pale and tentative. The storm's fury began to weaken, its rage spent in the long hours of night. As the first slivers of morning light pierced the cloud cover, he descended carefully, folding his colossal wings to reduce the violence of his passage. Snow drifted gently now rather than howling. The world below emerged in muted grays and whites. And there, at the very edge of a forest, he saw it. A humble cottage. Its roof bore the weight of heavy snow. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney, but faint warmth shimmered in the air around it. It stood alone, separated from the clustered homes of the nearby village, as though it had chosen solitude over safety. Within that small structure flickered the fragile flames he sought. The Emperor hovered above, concealed partially by the lingering cloud veil. His golden eyes narrowed, focusing through wood and stone as though they were no barrier at all. Inside, a human girl lay sleeping upon the floor beside a hearth whose embers glowed softly. Her hair spilled across the worn boards like a dark river. One slender arm curved protectively around two small forms nestled against her side. The hatchlings. Their scales, once dulled by frost, now shimmered faintly in hues of silver blue and crimson. Wisps of smoke rose lazily from their nostrils, no longer thin and desperate but steady and warm. Their tiny bodies were curled together, pressed close to the girl's warmth as if she were a nest crafted of living fire. The Emperor did not move. He did not roar in fury at the audacity of a human touching royal blood. He did not descend in blazing wrath, as legends would claim dragons always did when crossed. Instead, he watched. The girl's face was peaceful in sleep. There was exhaustion etched faintly in her features, shadows beneath her eyes, and a smudge of soot along her cheek. Her clothes were simple, worn from labor. There was no gold in that cottage, no grand wealth or hidden treasure, only modest belongings and the lingering scent of smoke and milk. She had nothing to gain. No promise of reward could have guided her actions. Dragons were creatures of myth to her kind, feared and misunderstood. Many humans would have fled at the sight of scaled wings and smoking breath. Others might have seized the opportunity for glory, believing slaying young dragons would bring renown. Yet she had done neither. She had offered warmth. The Emperor's immense heart, forged in ancient fires and tempered through centuries of rule, stirred with something unfamiliar. It was not pride, it was not mere relief. It was recognition. He could sense the memory of her actions lingering in the air, the way she had gathered the hatchlings without hesitation, the gentle care in her touch, the patience in her voice as she fed them. Dragons perceived more than sight and sound. They felt intent, tasted emotion like subtle flavors on the wind. Her kindness bore no trace of greed or fear-driven calculation. It was pure. Below, one of the hatchlings shifted in its sleep, a tiny claw flexing against the fabric of the blanket. A faint glow pulsed beneath its scales, brighter now than before. The other responded instinctively, curling closer to both sibling and girl alike. The Emperor's gaze softened, an almost imperceptible change in eyes capable of igniting forests. He remembered when he himself had been small, long before the first human village rose from earth. He remembered the protective curve of vast wings shielding him from cosmic storms. He remembered warmth offered freely. Dragons were often portrayed as creatures of dominion and fire alone, but at their core they were guardians of balance. They revered strength, yes, but also loyalty and courage. Above all, they honored those who protected life without expectation of reward. The girl had embodied that ancient code without knowing it. The first true rays of dawn spilled across the horizon then, brushing the snow-covered fields in pale gold. Light filtered through the thinning clouds and struck the Emperor's scales, igniting them in brilliant radiance. He hovered in silence, vast wings beating slow and steady. He could descend now. He could reclaim his hatchlings and return to the hidden valley before the village fully stirred. No mortal would dare challenge him. Fear would scatter them like leaves before flame. Yet as he watched the girl sleep, arms still draped protectively across his blood, he hesitated. Power demanded action. Wisdom required understanding. He extended his awareness gently downward, brushing against the edges of her mind, not to invade but to perceive. What he felt there astonished him further. Loneliness, yes, but not bitterness. Hardship, but no resentment, a quiet resilience woven through years of modest living. And beneath it all, a steady current of compassion that flowed without condition. She had seen not monsters at her door. She had seen suffering. The Emperor drew back, contemplative. Dragons and humans had not always been distant. In ancient eras long faded from mortal memory, there had been alliances, brief but profound, shared knowledge, mutual respect. Yet fear and ambition had sundered that fragile bond. Stories twisted over centuries until dragons became villains in human tales and humans became trespassers in dragon lore. Perhaps, he mused, the world required reminders. Below, the fire in the hearth dimmed slightly as embers settled. Instantly, one hatchling emitted a tiny flare from its nostrils, reigniting a small tongue of flame. It was instinctual, clumsy, but effective. The girl stirred faintly at the warmth, her arm tightening protectively even in sleep. A low rumble vibrated in the Emperor's chest, a sound too deep for mortal ears to detect. It was not anger. It was approval. The storm had nearly claimed his heirs. Winter had tested their fragile forms, yet through chance or perhaps destiny, they had encountered a heart capable of sheltering them. As the sun's disk crested fully over the distant hills, bathing the snowfields in radiant gold, the Emperor made his decision. He would not answer kindness with fear. He would not repay protection with terror. Instead, he would honor it. His wings unfurled wider, catching the newborn light. The clouds around him shimmered as though infused with molten fire. Energy gathered along his scales, not destructive flame, but something deeper and more ancient. A blessing, not lightly given. He circled once above the cottage, silent and immense. No villager yet stepped outside. The world remained hushed in the fragile stillness of early dawn. The Emperor lowered slightly, close enough that the air itself grew warm beneath him. Frost along the cottage roof began to melt in gentle rivulets. Snow around the clearing softened, no longer biting with lethal cold. Inside, the girl stirred more fully, sensing a change in the atmosphere. The hatchlings awoke as well, lifting their small heads. They felt him instantly, their father, their sovereign. But they did not recoil from the girls. They remained curled beside her. The Emperor regarded that simple fact with profound understanding. Power could command loyalty, but kindness earned it. The light around him intensified, casting long golden beams across the forest edge. Birds hidden within snow-laden branches fluttered in startled wonder. The very air thrummed with quiet awe. He would descend not in fury but in majesty. And the world below would witness that even the mightiest flame could bow in gratitude to a single act of compassion. With that resolve firm within his ancient heart, the Dragon Emperor began his measured descent toward the humble cottage at the forest's edge, carrying with him a dawn unlike any the village had ever known. The blessing at dawn. When Alira awoke, she did not move at first. For a fragile moment suspended between dream and daylight, she lay perfectly still on the wooden floor beside the hearth, unsure whether memory had woven illusions through her sleep. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving behind a bed of soft crimson embers that pulsed gently in the gray hush of early morning. The storm's furious howling was gone. In its place lingered a deep and watchful silence, as though the world itself held its breath. Her arm was still curved protectively around two small, warm shapes. She blinked slowly. The events of the night returned in a rush, the scratching at the door, the burst of snow, the trembling scaled bodies collapsing over her threshold. Dragon hatchlings, frostbitten wings, golden eyes clouded with weakness. Carefully, almost fearfully, she lifted her head. They were still there. Nestled against her side, wrapped in her woolen blanket, the hatchling stirred as dawn's faint light filtered through the small window. One stretched first, extending its tiny wings with a delicate rustle. The membranes caught the pale glow and shimmered faintly, one with a sheen of silver blue like moonlit ice, the other with a muted crimson that seemed to hold embers beneath its surface. The second hatchling yawned, revealing small but unmistakably sharp teeth. A thin curl of smoke escaped its mouth, rising lazily before dissolving into the cool air. They were alive. Not only alive, but stronger. Relief washed over Alira so deeply that her vision blurred. She had not realized until that moment how tightly fear had gripped her heart throughout the night. She had remained awake long past exhaustion's call, checking their warmth, feeding them small sips of milk, whispering reassurances into the flicker of the hearth. Now their scales gleamed with restored vitality. Their bodies radiated gentle heat, no longer the brittle chill of creatures at death's edge. One of them chirped softly upon noticing her gaze. It was a bright, inquisitive sound, nothing like the broken cry she had heard through the storm. The other nudged her wrist with its small snout as if acknowledging her presence. "You're truly here," she whispered, her voice rough with sleep and wonder. It wasn't a dream. The words had barely left her lips when the air shifted. At first, she thought the sun had simply risen more fully beyond the horizon. A warmer light began to seep through the window, gilding the edges of the wooden walls and turning the faint frost along the glass into glittering patterns. But this light did not behave like ordinary sunlight. It grew. It deepened. It became something far richer than dawn. The cottage filled with golden radiance, not blinding, not scorching, but powerful and immense. It poured through every crack and seemed as though the heavens themselves had opened above her home. Alira's breath caught in her throat. The roof did not burst into flame. The wooden beams did not splinter or groan beneath unbearable heat. Instead, warmth spread gently across her skin, sinking into her bones like the embrace of summer after a long winter. Outside, beyond the thin walls of her cottage, she heard faint cries, astonished voices rising from the direction of the village. She rose slowly to her knees, heart pounding. The hatchlings were already alert, their heads lifted sharply toward the ceiling. Their golden eyes glowed brighter now, reflecting the magnificent light pouring down upon them. A vast shadow swept across the small window. It circled once, twice. Though no roar split the air, Alira felt the presence before she saw it. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to hum with restrained power. The air trembled, not with violence but with majesty. She swallowed, steadying herself. There was only one being in all the stories ever told who could summon light like this. The Dragon Emperors. Every tale she had ever heard painted him as a creature of unfathomable might, a sovereign of flame whose wings eclipsed mountains, whose breath could turn armies to ash. Mothers used his name to hush unruly children. Warriors invoked him in whispered oaths. And he was here. Not in legend. Not in myths. Above her home. The hatchlings chirped suddenly, bright and eager. Without hesitation, they wriggled free from the blanket and scurried toward the door, their claws tapping against the wooden floor. Their movements were no longer weak. They bounded with lively energy, wings fluttering in excited bursts. Alira's heart hammered painfully against her ribs. She knew what waited outside. Fear rose within her, not for herself, but for what her presence might mean. Had she overstepped some boundary, would he see her touch upon his children as an insult? Yet beneath that fear lay something stronger. She had acted out of compassion. She would not hide from it now. Drawing in a steady breath, Alira stood and walked to the door. The golden light grew brighter as she reached for the latch. Warmth pulsed against her skin, neither oppressive nor harsh, only immense. She opened the door. The sight stole the air from her lungs. The Dragon Emperor descended in silence, vast wings unfurled against the morning sky. His scales shone like molten gold beneath the newborn sun, each one reflecting light in cascading waves. The air around him shimmered, bending subtly under the weight of his presence. He was colossal beyond comprehension. His body eclipsed the treetops, his wings stretched farther than the length of her entire clearing. When he lowered himself toward the earth, snow drifted outward in soft spirals rather than violent gusts, as though even winter dared not challenge him. Villagers stood at a distance near the forest's edge, shielding their eyes, mouths agape. None dared approach. Some fell to their knees instinctively, overwhelmed by awe and fear alike. But Alira remained standing in her doorway. The hatchlings darted past her feet and bounded across the snow, which melted beneath their warmth. They chirped joyfully, leaping toward the immense golden figure with unrestrained affection. The Emperor lowered his magnificent head. His eyes, vast and radiant like twin suns, focused first upon the hatchlings. They climbed eagerly along the curve of his foreleg, their small forms dwarfed by his scales. One nuzzled beneath his jaw. The other fluttered upward briefly before settling against his neck. A low rumble vibrated through the air, not a threat, but something akin to a deep, resonant purr. Then his gaze shifted. It fell upon Alira. She felt it like sunlight concentrated into a single beam, intense, penetrating, ancient. Her knees trembled, yet she did not look away. Though fear coursed through her veins, she lifted her chin slightly. "I meant no harm," she said softly, though her voice barely carried beyond her own ears. The Emperor did not respond with sound. Instead, something far stranger occurred. A warmth blossomed within her chest, gentle at first, then expanding outward in luminous waves. It filled her thoughts, her senses, her very being. The world around her dimmed slightly, as though she stood within a sphere of golden light separate from all else. And within that radiance she heard him. Not as a voice striking her ears, but as words forming directly within her heart. "You sheltered my blood when frost sought to claim them." The presence was vast yet measured, powerful yet deliberate. Each word resonated like the tolling of a great bell. "You offered warmth without knowledge of reward. You chose compassion over fear." Tears gathered in Alira's eyes without her fully understanding why. The emotion in the Emperor's presence was not wrath, it was acknowledgement. "I could not leave them," she whispered, though she knew he understood her thoughts before she formed them. They were suffering. The golden gaze softened, subtly but unmistakably. "And for that you shall not go unrewarded." The light around them intensified, spreading outward across the clearing. Snow at Alira's feet began to melt, not in violent steam, but in gentle rivulets that soaked into the earth. The frost along her cottage walls dissolved like mist beneath the sun. The Emperor inhaled deeply. Alira braced herself instinctively, expecting fire. But what emerged from his vast jaws was not flame. It was a shimmering golden mist, luminous and ethereal. It flowed outward in a graceful arc, enveloping her home in radiant brilliance. The mist did not scorch wood or stone, instead it seeped into them like life-giving breath. The transformation began immediately. The snow surrounding her cottage receded further, revealing dark soil beneath, rich and fertile despite winter's grip on the land. Small green shoots pushed through the earth as though summoned by hidden hands. At the edge of her clearing stood a row of bare fruit trees, skeletal against the cold. As the mist touched them, buds swelled along their branches. Within heartbeats, blossoms erupted in delicate clusters of pink and white, filling the air with fragrance wholly out of season. Alira gasped. The roof above her head creaked softly, not in strain but in renewal. Cracks along the beams sealed seamlessly. The worn shingles straightened and strengthened, gleaming faintly as though infused with quiet resilience. Beside her cottage lay a modest stone well, often temperamental in the dry months. The golden mist coiled around it, sinking into its depths. A clear, musical sound echoed upward, like water rising joyfully to greet the light. Within moments, the transformation was complete. Her humble home stood radiant amid a ring of fertile earth and blooming life, untouched by the lingering frost beyond its boundary. The air above her clearing shimmered faintly, as though an unseen shield now guarded it. From this dawn forward, the Emperor's voice resonated within her. "No storm shall touch your land without bowing to your door. No drought shall empty your well. No winter shall steal warmth from your hearth." Alira fell to her knees, not from command but from overwhelming gratitude and awe. "I did nothing deserving of this," she murmured. The Emperor's vast presence pulsed gently. "Compassion without expectation is rare. It shapes the world more profoundly than fire or conquest." The hatchlings chirped in agreement, fluttering around his neck. They glanced toward Alira once more, their golden eyes bright with something resembling affection. The moment stretched timeless and suspended between earth and sky. Then slowly, the golden light began to recede. The mist dissolved into faint sparkles that drifted upward like morning dew lifted by the sun. The Emperor rose to his full height, wings unfurling magnificently. Each beat sent gentle waves of warm air across the clearing, bending the newly bloomed branches in respectful arcs. He regarded Alira one final time. She felt no fear now, only a deep, abiding sense of connection, as though a thread of golden light bound her small life to something vast and eternal. With a powerful surge, the Emperor leapt skyward. The hatchlings clung to him, their small forms secure against his scales. He ascended in widening spirals, golden light trailing behind him like a comet's tail. Higher and higher he soared, until his radiant figure merged with the brilliance of the morning sun. Silence settled once more. The villagers slowly emerged from their stunned stillness, whispering in disbelief. Some approached cautiously, marveling at the sudden bloom of flowers and the absence of snow around her cottage. But Alira remained where she knelt for several long moments, absorbing the warmth that lingered in the air. At last she rose. Her home looked much as it had before, small, simple, unadorned by grandeur, yet something fundamental had changed. The earth beneath her feet thrummed with quiet vitality. The air held a softness that promised protection. She returned inside and stood by the hearth. Though the fire had nearly died, it flared gently as she approached, as though recognizing her presence anew. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, not of fear nor even of joy alone, but of profound humility. She had not sought blessing. She had only answered suffering with care. Days passed, word of the Emperor's descent spread beyond the village, carried by traders and travelers. Some arrived hopping to glimpse signs of lingering magic. Others came seeking proof of legend. But Alira did not change. She continued to leave crumbs upon her windowsill. She continued to mend gloves and tend her small garden, now flourishing even in seasons that once brought hardship. She drew water from her well, clear and abundant. Storms still swept across the valley in winter, but when they neared her clearing, their winds softened, their fury dimmed. Snow fell lightly there, never again piling high enough to threaten her door. Years later, villagers would tell their children the tale of the dawn when a dragon bowed to a human heart. They would speak of golden light and blooming trees. But Alira herself remembered something simpler. She remembered two trembling creatures at her door. And she remembered choosing not to turn them away. Her home stood forever blessed, not as a monument to power, but as quiet testimony to a truth often forgotten. That the greatest force in all the world was not flame that scorched the sky, not wings that spanned mountains, but a compassionate heart brave enough to care, even in the coldest night.